The previous 3 parts of this series provide overwhelming evidence that American President Franklin Roosevelt knew a Japanese carrier force was sailing east to attack Hawaii in late 1941. Few Americans know about this shocking fact because their government controls informational sources. However, the truth can be unearthed after careful research. In 2023, the new owner of Twitter, Elon Musk, sought freer speech on that platform after learning that 80 FBI agents were assigned to flag content the government wanted censored. Their role was exposed, as well as other methods used to propagandize Twitter users. Musk labeled media accounts used by the American government's NPR, PBS, and the British BBC as government-funded media, as was done with all other government-funded media. These 3 organizations were somehow exempt, even though they are government-funded and run by government appointees, who only allow government-approved news and history. The BBC objected because they consider themselves independent. This was true in the past, as it was with NPR and PBS, but over the past 2 decades, censorship became a priority. Their governments exerted pressure to follow reporting guidelines. As a result, even older, uncensored content has disappeared from their websites. The BBC produces documentaries for their Timeline collection that can be watched online. It produced outstanding investigative documentaries about important world events in the past, such as Operation Gladio, about CIA terrorism in Europe, and USS Liberty, Dead in the Water, about the intentional Israeli attack on a U.S. Navy surveillance ship. Both of these are linked in the description to small private channels that copied them because they can't be found on the Timeline channel nor any other BBC channel. In 1989, the BBC produced a great documentary about the Pearl Harbor attack titled Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor. It can't be found anywhere on BBC channels, but can be found on 2 tiny private channels. I linked one in the description. They are hacked into 8 10-minute segments to evade YouTube's copyright detection software. I downloaded and merged them into one video and tried to post it at YouTube, but it got flagged and blocked. The software normally allows posting, but sends a copyright notice that any revenue earned will be sent to the owner. But the BBC chose the rarely used option to block posting, so it remains censored, and the BBC gets no free revenue from its documentary. The BBC does not want it seen, but apparently doesn't know or care about the segmented posting at 2 tiny channels that get few views. If you watch Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor, you will see why.
New evidence now suggests that the Americans and the British knew a great deal more about the coming attack than has ever been officially admitted.
Not only does this documentary expose the truth, the title says that President Franklin Roosevelt sacrificed 2,403 Americans at Pearl Harbor to trick Americans to support his goal of entering World War II. The BBC's Timeline series has 7 newer documentaries about Pearl Harbor that ignore disturbing facts. One about code breaking uses official experts to distort proof that Roosevelt knew about the attack in advance. They say Americans were unable to break JN 25, the Japanese naval code, until months after Pearl Harbor, so the Americans knew nothing. They do not discuss radio direction finding. This method detected coded Japanese signals from ships and aircraft and shared bearings to plot the source location using triangulation. It doesn't matter if they couldn't read the code. The U.S. Navy detected coded messages and the northeastern Pacific Ocean. The United States had imposed a trade embargo on Japan several months prior, so there was no reason for ships to be sailing east from there. The United States Navy had radio detection finding sites in Hawaii, the Philippines, Alaska, and California. This allowed U.S. naval intelligence in Hawaii to locate Japanese signals in the Western Pacific by sharing signal information with a station in the Philippines. But the stations in Alaska and California did not share information with Hawaii. The Philippines was either too far or instructed not to share information about radio intercepts in the North Pacific with Hawaii. Any radio operator hearing radio signals from this area would take note, to include one aboard a cruise ship. Radio direction findings from all stations were transmitted to Navy headquarters in Washington, D.C. and plotted on maps. This is mentioned in the BBC documentary.
Isolated in the Central Pacific, the closest Kimmel ever got to the detailed planning of the Japanese Navy was information that could be picked up from radio interception and direction findings techniques. From Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor, the Americans listened in day and night to Japanese naval signals sent by radio throughout the fleet. Hypo was one of a ring of stations which worked together to get radio fixes on Japanese naval transmitters.
Saturday, I went in without Hosmer and plotted the information that I had, and I was excited enough about finding the fleet was 500 miles north of Hawaiian Islands to drive to his home that Saturday afternoon and tell him what I had found and where it was, rather than giving any of this information by phone to him. However, we surmised between us something was going to happen, and whether it was definitely going to be the island.
Establishment historians insist that no radio signals were sent from the Japanese naval force, and often quote a Japanese naval officer. But the BBC documentary and evidence presented in several books document that coded signals were sent. I'm sure the Japanese task force desired radio silence, but coordinating a huge task force with 24 ships and hundreds of aircraft must have required a few emergency exceptions, especially after some destroyers became separated during a storm. And it doesn't matter if the signals were weak, short, garbled by atmospherics, or couldn't be decoded. The signal could be located with triangulation. Once again, the entire BBC documentary is linked in the description. Here are key segments.
Washington had set up a source of secret information. This monitoring station, designated MS-5, had been ordered to tap into the Trans-Pacific cable for messages addressed to the Japanese consulate a few miles away in Honolulu. The small signals team at the station was ordered to send the messages directly to Army intelligence in Washington, undeciphered. They had instructions that no one on the island was to be informed of these messages. 5 days later, another signal was picked up at the secret station. It seems unbelievable, but neither Short nor Kimmel were informed about any of the signals. Commander Lawrence Safford had been waiting for the intercept. He took it himself to the office of Rear Admiral Lee Noyes. He heard Noyes phone the head of military intelligence to say the message was in. Colonel Otis Sadler drafted an immediate dispatch to General Short to warn him of the danger. But when Sadler saw the Admiral later in his office, Noyes refused to confirm the message, and Sadler's warning was never sent. Later that same morning, a young journalist drove into Washington. Joe Lieb had influential contacts in Roosevelt's administration.
Cordell Hull was Secretary of State, and he called me on Saturday morning around 9:30 and asked if I could come over to see him. I came over, didn't live far from there, and he met me out in front of the State Department, the old State Department, and we were walking towards the White House, and he mentioned that he had something very important to talk to, and we wanted to sit down. And we walked across the street to Lafayette Park, sat on the bench, and he started to relate that Pearl Harbor would be attacked on December the 7th. Specifically, he emphasized December the 7th, and that he wanted me to know, because I had helped him on other issues, that if anything should erupt against him, that he would be protected by a friend, which I have been to him. And he then related, he pulled out of his pocket the transcript, which stated specifically that Pearl Harbor would be attacked on December the 7th.
For nearly 50 years, one question has been repeatedly asked. Did Roosevelt allow Pearl Harbor to happen so that the surprise attack would give him the excuse to take America into the Second World War? The new evidence that has come to light strongly suggests that he did. It is now clear that Roosevelt and his advisors knew far more than was openly admitted at any of the 9 separate inquiries into the attack. William Casey, a former director of the CIA, was in a position to testify where some of that information came from. In his book, Casey says quite openly that the British told the Americans that a Japanese fleet was heading east across the Pacific towards Hawaii. It is now known that Churchill used this intelligence to give British commanders in the Far East early warning of the imminence of a Japanese attack. But no similar warnings were ever sent from Roosevelt to the American commanders in the Pacific.
President Franklin Roosevelt sacrificed thousands of Americans at Pearl Harbor, and hundreds of thousands more during World War II in a failed attempt to establish a United Nations in New York to rule the world. Western governments don't want this known.
The aftermath of the attack leaves 8 of the 9 battleships heavily damaged or destroyed. USS Arizona, USS West Virginia, USS Oklahoma, USS California, and USS Utah have all been sunk. Another 11 ships, including destroyers, cruisers, repair ships, and mine layers, are also heavily damaged or destroyed. 188 aircraft belonging to the U.S. Army and Navy are destroyed, and another 159 are severely damaged. The human toll is heaviest. 2,390 Americans lose their lives.